The first flakes fell on November 14, 1883, in the Bitterroot Valley of western Montana, and Henrik Lundgren figured they'd seen worse. What he hadn't figured on was the woman living in a hole in the mountainside being right about everything, or that 6 days later he'd be hauling his pregnant wife through waist-deep snow begging for a place she'd offered them 4 months earlier. But that's getting ahead of things. The real story started back in July when Ingrid Torsten arrived in the settlement of Stevensville with a mule, 3 wooden crates, and plans that made everyone within earshot question her sanity. She was 37 years old, stood 5'6", and spoke English with a Swedish accent thick enough to spread on bread. Her husband had died of pneumonia 2 winters back in a dugout near Bismarck, Dakota Territory, and she'd decided that freezing to death in a dirt box wasn't how she planned to go. The land she'd claimed sat a half-mile up the western slope where Sleeping Child Creek cut through granite formations that had been there since before anyone's God was keeping track. Most folks settling the valley wanted bottomland near the creek for farming. Ingrid wanted the cave. It wasn't much to look at initially. The opening measured maybe 8 feet across and 12 feet high, carved by water over millennia into the hillside. The cavity extended back 43 feet into the mountain, narrowing gradually to a crawl space that continued who knows how far. The temperature inside held steady at 52 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, summer or winter. Ingrid walked in that first morning in July, held up her lantern and smiled like she'd found her mother's silver. Henrik Lundgren thought she'd lost her mind. He'd come west from Minnesota in 1879, homesteaded 160 acres of Good Creek bottom land, built a proper cabin with milled lumber from Missoula, and established himself as the most successful wheat farmer in the valley. When Ingrid started hauling stone from the creek bed to wall up the cave entrance, Henrik rode up to have what he considered a reasonable conversation. "Mrs. Torsten," he said, keeping his voice level like he was talking to a spooked horse. "That's a cave. People don't live in caves. We've got civilization out here." Ingrid didn't look up from mortaring fieldstone. "Civilization is what keeps you warm when it's 40 below. Cave keeps me warm." "Which one is more civilized?" Henrik had a wife 7 months pregnant with their 3rd child, a cabin that had cost him $800 in lumber and labor, and no patience for immigrant women who thought they knew better than established settlers. "That cave floods every spring," he said. "Ask anyone who's been here more than 1 season." "The back floods," Ingrid agreed. "Front stays dry. I checked the high water marks, 16 inches up the wall at the deepest point. I'm building my floor 24 inches up." She had an answer for everything, which Henrik found deeply irritating. He wasn't alone. By August, Ingrid had become the valley's favorite topic of speculation, usually around the theme of how long before she gave up and moved back to wherever Swedes came from. Marcus Webb had opinions, too. He'd been a sergeant in the territorial militia, fought in skirmishes with the Nez Perce in '77, and knew a thing or two about winter survival in Montana. He also knew that caves were fine for temporary shelter but no place for permanent habitation. "The air goes stale," he told her when he stopped by one afternoon. "You'll suffocate by February." Ingrid was fitting a door frame into the stone wall she'd built across the cave entrance. The frame was double-walled pine, with a 3-inch gap she planned to pack with sawdust for insulation. "Caves breathe through cracks in the rock," she said. "Back passage pulls in fresh air. I've got 4 ventilation channels I'm drilling through to the surface. Physics doesn't care what you think about caves." Marcus didn't appreciate the lecture. He was 43 years old, had survived winters that killed lesser men, and didn't need some newcomer explaining physics. "You'll see," he said, which was what people said when they didn't have a better argument. The third skeptic was Father Brennan, who served the small Catholic community from a church he'd built with his own hands using timber he'd cut himself. He was Irish, 56 years old, and firmly believed that God had created the earth for man to build upon, not burrow into like an animal. He approached the theological issue with Ingrid one Sunday after Mass. "The Lord didn't intend us to live beneath the ground," he said gently. "The grave is beneath. Life is above." Ingrid, who hadn't been to Mass since her husband died but had come this once out of curiosity about the community, considered this. "In Sweden we have a saying, 'The bear doesn't ask the priest where to den for winter.' I don't think your God minds where I sleep as long as I don't freeze to death doing it." Father Brennan added her to his prayers, which Ingrid figured couldn't hurt. The fourth voice of concern came from Eleanor Whitmore, who at 61 was the oldest woman in the settlement and had survived more Montana winters than anyone else still breathing. She'd lost her first husband to hypothermia in 1867, her second to a falling tree in 1874, and had raised 7 children in a succession of increasingly better cabins. She knew what winter meant up here. "Child," she said. She called everyone under 50 child. "I've seen storms that killed livestock standing up. Froze them solid while they were still on their feet. A cave won't save you when the real cold comes." But Ingrid kept working. By September, she'd completed the stone wall across the cave entrance, leaving space for the insulated door and 2 small windows with double-paned glass she'd ordered from a catalog and hauled from Missoula herself. She'd built a raised floor platform 24 inches high using the straightest pine she could mill, creating a dry living space that measured 32 feet deep and averaged 9 feet wide. Beneath the platform, she dug channels that connected to the natural drainage at the back of the cave, ensuring any seepage would flow away from her living area. Here's something most people don't know about thermal mass. Rock stores heat during the day and releases it at night, moderating temperature swings. Ingrid knew this from watching her grandmother's root cellar in Sweden, where vegetables never froze even in the depths of winter. The cave's granite walls, she calculated, contained approximately 2,400 cubic feet of stone within her living space. That much rock, at a baseline temperature of 52 degrees, would act like a massive thermal battery. She installed a small wood stove, not for primary heat but for cooking and taking the edge off on the coldest days. The stovepipe ran up through one of her ventilation channels, drawing efficiently and creating a convection current that pulled fresh air through the other channels. The entire heating system required maybe 1/8 the firewood a conventional cabin would need. By October, she had furniture built, shelves installed, and provisions stored: 340 pounds of wheat flour, 180 pounds of cornmeal, 120 pounds of salt pork, 45 pounds of dried beans, and enough preserved vegetables to last through May. Her water came from a spring 17 feet from the cave entrance that never froze because it emerged from deep enough in the mountain to stay above freezing even when the air temperature hit -40. The settlement watched all this with a mixture of amusement and concern. Ingrid Torsten was clearly intelligent and hard-working, but she was also clearly wasting her time on an experiment that winter would prove foolish. Henrik Lundgren, whose cabin was now completely finished with a proper stone chimney and a root cellar dug underneath, felt vindicated every time he looked up at that cave entrance. He'd done things right. She'd done them strange. If you're watching this because you value the old knowledge, the skills that kept people alive when there was no one to call for help and no modern systems to fall back on, well, consider subscribing. We're documenting techniques that worked before electricity, before supply chains, before any of the conveniences we take for granted. Help us preserve what people like Ingrid Torsten knew before it's completely forgotten. November came in cold. The first hard freeze hit on November 3rd, dropping temperatures to 18 degrees Fahrenheit and putting a skim of ice on every water bucket in the valley. Henrik's cabin held heat well enough with the stove running full. He burned through a quarter cord of wood that first week of November, which was about what he'd expected. Up the slope, Ingrid burned maybe 15 pounds of firewood total, mostly for cooking. The cave sat at its steady 52 degrees. Marcus Webb stopped by on November 8th, ostensibly to check on her welfare, but really to see if she'd started having second thoughts. He found her outside in a light jacket, working on a series of rock cairns she was building at strategic points between her cave and the settlement. "Marker stones," she explained. "When the snow gets deep and the wind erases everything, you can navigate by following cairns. I'm spacing them 42 feet apart. That's how far you can see in a whiteout if the next cairn is 5 feet high." Marcus looked at the line of stone piles marching down the slope. There were 12 of them, each precisely placed, each built to the same height. It was the kind of preparation that made him uncomfortable because it suggested she might know something he didn't. "You expecting something particular?" he asked. Ingrid straightened, pushing hair back from her face. "I'm expecting winter in Montana, aren't you?" What she didn't say, because it would have sounded too dramatic, was that her grandmother in Sweden had taught her to read weather in ways that had nothing to do with almanacs or folklore. Water temperature in springs, migration patterns of birds, the angle at which geese flew south, the thickness of pine pitch, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. This winter was going to be biblical. The temperature dropped to 9 degrees on November 11th. Henrik's wife, Greta, was now 8 months pregnant and moving like a ship in heavy seas. Their cabin was warm enough, but it took constant attention to the stove, constant feeding of firewood, constant vigilance. Henrik had laid in 3 cords of wood, which should have been plenty, but he was burning through it faster than anticipated. A cord of wood weighs roughly 2,800 pounds when dry. He'd already burned through half a cord and winter had barely started. Eleanor Whitmore noticed the weather too. She'd been through the winter of 1866 when snow had fallen from October through April and the temperature hadn't risen above freezing for 73 consecutive days. Men had died that winter, good men, prepared men, because preparation only went so far when nature decided to remind humans how small they really were. She made her way up to Ingrid's cave on November 12th, climbing the slope with the slow determination of someone who'd learned that fast movement in rough terrain was how you broke a hip. Ingrid welcomed her in, and Eleanor got her first real look at what the Swedish woman had built. The interior was remarkable. The raised floor platform was solid as a church. The wood stove radiated gentle warmth that the rock walls absorbed and reflected, and the whole space felt comfortable in a way that defied its caveness. A thermometer on the wall read 54 degrees, and Ingrid wasn't even running the stove. "How?" Eleanor asked simply. Ingrid poured her tea from a kettle that sat on the stove's edge. "The earth is warmer than the air in winter. The rock holds temperature steady. I don't fight the cold, I just stay where the cold isn't." Eleanor sipped the tea, which was better than what she made at home. "You planning to share this if things get bad?" "My door is always open," Ingrid said. "Well, not always. But when it matters, yes." Eleanor left feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time about winter in Montana. Curiosity about what would happen instead of dread about what might. The snow started on November 14th at 3:17 in the afternoon. Small flakes at first, the kind that might blow over in an hour or settle into a modest overnight dusting. By sunset, the flakes were the size of silver dollars and falling so thick that you couldn't see 20 feet. By midnight, there were 8 inches on the ground and no sign of stopping. Henrik woke on November 15th to a world transformed. Snow was still falling, had never stopped falling, and there was already 23 inches of accumulation. The wind had picked up too, howling down from the mountains and pushing the snow into drifts that buried his fence posts. He fed the stove, got coffee going, and tried not to think about the woodpile outside that was now under 2 feet of snow. By noon, there were 31 inches on the ground. By sunset, 39. The temperature had dropped to minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was strong enough to shake the cabin's walls. Henrik burned wood faster than he wanted to admit, trying to keep the interior temperature above 60 degrees for Greta's sake. She sat near the stove, hands on her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick and wondering what kind of world they'd brought a child into. November 16th brought no relief. The snow continued. The temperature dropped to minus 18. Henrik's woodpile, which he'd carefully stacked and covered with canvas, was now almost completely buried. Retrieving wood meant wading through waist-deep snow, fighting wind that tried to steal your breath, and hoping you didn't lose your bearings on the way back. He brought in as much as he could carry, maybe 80 pounds worth, knowing it would last only a few hours at the rate they were burning it. Up at the cave, Ingrid's thermometer read 51 degrees. She'd lit the stove once the day before to make soup, then let it go out. The cave needed no additional heat. She sat by her double-paned window watching the storm, knitting a sweater from wool she'd traded for in September, and occasionally checking her ventilation channels to make sure they weren't blocked. They weren't. The physics of convection meant warm air rose through the channels to the surface, melting snow as it went, keeping them clear. Marcus Webb's situation was growing desperate. His cabin was well built but smaller than Henrik's, and he lived alone, which meant no one to help with the constant wood feeding the stove demanded. He'd gone through half his wood supply in 3 days. At this rate, he'd run out before the storm ended, assuming it ever did. His hands were cracked and bleeding from constant exposure to cold and rough wood. His feet were starting to go numb in a way that worried him. Father Brennan's church had a good stove, but the building was designed for weekly services, not continuous habitation. He was staying there rather than in his smaller personal cabin, reasoning that one large space was easier to heat than 2 small ones. He was wrong. The church's high ceiling meant heat rose and stayed there. leaving the lower space where he actually lived frigidly cold. He wore every piece of clothing he owned and still shivered. November 17th was when people started to realize this wasn't a normal storm. 57 inches of snow now, temperature minus 23 degrees, wind gusts strong enough to tear shingles off roofs. Henrik's woodpile was gone, not used up, but literally buried so deep he couldn't find it anymore. He was burning furniture, first the chairs, then the small table, then their bed frame. Greta was crying quietly, trying not to add to Henrik's stress. But the cold was seeping in through every gap in the walls, and the baby was coming soon, maybe too soon. That's when Henrik remembered what Ingrid had said. Her door was always open. When it mattered, this mattered. The journey from his cabin to Ingrid's cave was a quarter mile. In good weather, a 10-minute walk. In this storm, with Greta 8 months pregnant and the snow over 3 feet deep in most places and 6 feet deep in the drifts, it was an expedition that could kill them both. But staying would definitely kill them. Henrik made the calculation that desperate men make when there's no good choice, only a less bad one. They left at first light on November 18th, what passed for first light anyway in a storm that had turned day into twilight. Henrik went first, breaking trail, trying to follow the slope up toward where he knew the cave was. Greta followed, her hands on his shoulders, trusting him to navigate when she couldn't see 5 feet ahead. The wind screamed. The cold was a physical force trying to stop them. Henrik's lungs burned with each breath of air that was far too cold for human respiration. He missed the first cairn completely, walked right past it in the whiteout. But he found the second one, materializing like a miracle out of the snow, and suddenly he understood what Ingrid had been doing. The cairns were a lifeline, a navigation system for exactly this situation. He followed them upward, counting them off. 3, 4, 5. Until he saw the dark opening of the cave entrance and the glow of lamplight through a double-paned window. Ingrid opened the door before he could knock. She'd been watching through the window, saw them coming, and had blankets ready. She pulled them inside, got them out of their wet outer clothes, wrapped them in wool, and sat them by the stove with hot tea in their hands. The cave was 53 degrees, which felt like a sauna after the minus 25 they'd just come through. "I should have listened," Henrik said when he could speak again. His face was red with frostbite, but it wasn't severe, painful but not tissue-destroying. "You're listening now," Ingrid said. "That's what matters." Greta started labor that night. Maybe it was the stress of the journey, maybe it was just timing, but the contractions started at 11 p.m. and didn't stop. Eleanor Whitmore made her way to the cave at first light on November 19th, navigating by the cairns because at 71 years old, she wasn't about to let a storm stop her from attending a birth. She arrived half-frozen but competent, and together with Ingrid, they delivered Henrik and Greta's son at 4:23 p.m. on November 19, 1883, in a cave in Montana, while outside the temperature hit minus 31 degrees and the snow kept falling. They named him Magnus, which means great in Latin, because surviving the first day of your life in those conditions deserved a great name. Marcus Webb arrived on November 20th, barely conscious from hypothermia, his cabin having burned through the last of his wood 12 hours earlier. Father Brennan came that evening, having abandoned the church when ice started forming on the inside walls. The cave, designed for one woman, now housed 7 people and felt crowded but warm. The storm continued through November 21st, 73 inches of total snowfall, temperature fluctuating between minus 19 and minus 34. Wind gusts recorded at the weather station in Missoula, 48 miles away, at 67 miles per hour. The settlement of Stevensville was buried. Cabins were crushed by snow load. Livestock froze in their shelters. The church's roof collapsed on November 22nd under the weight of snow that exceeded the bearing capacity of hand-hewn timbers. Inside the cave, the temperature held at 52 degrees. Ingrid's ventilation system kept the air fresh even with 7 people breathing it. Her food stores were adequate to share. Her water spring continued flowing. The thermal mass of the mountain absorbed all of winter's fury and gave back only gentle, steady warmth. The storm broke on November 23rd. 6 days total. When people finally dug out and could take stock of the damage, they found that of the 23 households in the Stevensville area, 11 had lost their primary structures to snow load or fire from overheated stoves. 4 people had died from hypothermia or carbon monoxide poisoning. 17 had survived only by making their way to Ingrid Torsten's cave, following the cairns she'd built, finding shelter in the hole in the mountain that everyone had mocked. If you've watched this far, you understand why this knowledge matters. This wasn't just about one storm or one cave. This was about understanding principles that don't require electricity or supply chains or modern systems. Heat doesn't come from burning wood. Heat comes from being in a space that holds it. Survival doesn't come from fighting nature. It comes from working with it. Hit that like button if you think knowledge like this deserves to be preserved and shared, because we're going to need it again someday. The aftermath was practical and philosophical in equal measure. Henrik Lundgren rebuilt his cabin the following spring, but he built it different. He incorporated earth berming on the north side, added a root cellar that extended under the entire structure, and installed a thermal mass system using rocks from the creek bed. His firewood consumption dropped by 62% compared to his original cabin design. Marcus Webb built his new home partially into a hillside, using the earth as insulation. Father Brennan rebuilt his church, but he also built a small winter shelter using Ingrid's principles for when the next storm came. Because there would be another storm. Montana promised that much. Eleanor Whitmore lived to see the winter of 1889, which was nearly as bad as 83, and she spent it comfortably in a cave dwelling she'd excavated with the help of 3 young men who thought they knew everything about frontier living until she showed them different. She died in 1891 at age 69, warm in her sleep, in a space that maintained 54 degrees while outside it was -40. Ingrid Torsten lived in that cave until 1897, when she sold the claim to a family of German immigrants who'd heard about her shelter and wanted to learn. She moved to Missoula, bought a small house with money she'd saved, and spent her remaining years teaching earth-sheltered construction techniques to anyone who asked. She died in 1909 at age 63, and her obituary in the Missoulian ran under the headline, "Cave Woman Who Saved Stevensville Dies." The paper meant it respectfully. Magnus Lundgren, the boy born in a cave during the worst storm of the decade, grew up to become a civil engineer specializing in sustainable architecture. In 1924, he published a paper titled Thermal Mass Applications in Residential Construction, which detailed exactly how his birthplace had maintained temperature stability without active heating. His work influenced a generation of architects who were just beginning to understand that old techniques weren't primitive. They were sophisticated solutions to fundamental problems. Modern earth-sheltered homes use the same principles Ingrid applied in 1883. Underground structures maintain 50 to 60 degrees year-round across most climates. Thermal mass reduces heating and cooling costs by 60–80% compared to conventional construction. Ventilation through convection eliminates the need for mechanical air circulation. The physics hasn't changed, only our willingness to remember it. The cave still exists. The Bitterroot Valley Historical Society maintains it as a heritage site, and you can visit if you're ever in Montana. The interior temperature was measured at 51 degrees Fahrenheit in January 2024 during a cold snap that pushed outside temperatures to -18. No heating system, no electricity. Just rock and physics, doing what they've always done. Here's what the historical record shows. Conventional cabins in the Stevensville area during the 1880s required 3 per 5 cords of firewood per winter to maintain livable temperatures. Ingrid's cave used approximately 1/4 cord, primarily for cooking. That's an 85–94% reduction in energy consumption using technology available in the 1880s. The firewood saved represents hundreds of hours of labor not spent cutting, splitting, hauling, and burning. Labor that could be applied to agriculture, craft work, or simply staying healthy. The skeptics weren't wrong to question her approach. They were wrong to assume that their experience was the only valid experience. Henrik Lundgren was an excellent farmer who built a solid cabin using the best practices he knew. Marcus Webb was a capable frontiersman who'd survived genuine hardship. Father Brennan was a devoted servant who'd built a church with his own hands. Eleanor Whitmore had outlived 2 husbands and raised 7 children in one of the harshest environments on the continent. They weren't fools. They were competent people operating on incomplete information, which is the human condition in any era. What changed wasn't their competence. It was their willingness to learn from someone whose approach differed from their own. Ingrid Torsten understood something fundamental. Shelter isn't about the structure you build above ground. It's about the relationship between temperature, mass, insulation, and human physiology. You can maintain that relationship with conventional construction, but it requires massive energy input. Or you can work with natural systems that already maintain the relationship, and your energy requirement drops to nearly zero. The principle applies beyond shelter. Food preservation using cellars and springs instead of ice houses. Water systems using gravity instead of pumps. Heating using thermal mass instead of continuous combustion. All of it proven, all of it documented, all of it largely forgotten in favor of systems that require external energy inputs we assume will always be available. But assumptions aren't guarantees. The settlers of Stevensville assumed winter storms had limits. They assumed their preparation was adequate. They assumed conventional construction was superior to earth sheltering because it looked more civilized. The storm of November 1883 corrected every assumption at the cost of 4 lives and massive property destruction. Knowledge preserved is lives saved, not metaphorically, literally. Every person who made it to Ingrid's cave lived because she'd maintained knowledge from a different context and applied it to new circumstances. Every person who stubbornly trusted conventional wisdom over empirical adaptation paid a price in frozen fingers, burned furniture, or collapsed structures. If you value the preservation of this kind of knowledge, the tested, proven, life-saving techniques that worked before modern systems existed, then subscribe to this channel. We're documenting what people like Ingrid Thorsten knew, what Magnus Lundgren learned, what Eleanor Whitmore taught, and what the frontier required. This isn't nostalgia. This is the practical wisdom that kept humans alive in environments that wanted them dead. And it matters now more than it did then because now we've forgotten it exists. The lesson of the cave shelter isn't that everyone should live underground. It's that solutions don't have to be conventional to be effective. It's that wisdom can come from unexpected sources. It's that survival sometimes means admitting you don't know everything and learning from people who know different things. Henrik Lundgren learned this while hauling his pregnant wife through a blizzard, realizing too late that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. Marcus Webb learned it while his hands bled and his firewood ran out. Father Brennan learned it when his church collapsed. Eleanor Whitmore, who thought she'd seen every winter Montana could throw at her, learned that there was always something new to learn. And maybe that's the real knowledge worth preserving. Not the specific technique of building a cave shelter, but the mindset that stays curious, stays humble, and stays willing to learn from people who approach problems differently. The cave saved lives in 1883. That mindset saves lives every generation. The snow melted eventually. It always does. Spring came to the Bitterroot Valley in 1884, turning the massive snowpack into floods that reshaped the creek beds and washed away anything that wasn't built to last. Ingrid's cave drained perfectly, her channels carrying away the meltwater exactly as she'd designed. The settlement rebuilt, but it rebuilt different, incorporating lessons learned at the cost of 4 lives and the destruction of half the town. Some knowledge you can read in books. Some knowledge has to be learned in blood and cold and desperation. The frontier provided plenty of the latter. What the frontier couldn't guarantee was that people would remember what they'd learned or that they'd pass it on to others who might need it. That's why we're here. That's why this channel exists. Not to romanticize the frontier, but to preserve what the frontier taught. How to survive when systems fail, how to adapt when conditions exceed expectations, how to learn from people who know things you don't. The cave shelter in Montana is one story among thousands, but it's a story that contains principles applicable anywhere. Use thermal mass, work with natural systems, prepare for extremes, stay humble about your own knowledge, learn from people different from you. These aren't frontier values, they're human values, tested in the harshest laboratory available and proven to keep people alive. Ingrid Thorsten didn't build a cave shelter because she loved caves. She built it because she understood the mathematics of survival in Montana winter, and she was willing to be mocked by her entire community to apply that understanding. Her reward was staying alive, keeping others alive, and demonstrating that sometimes the old knowledge, the knowledge dismissed as primitive or outdated, is actually the knowledge that saves lives when nothing else will. The frontier is closed now. The last homestead claims were filed in the 1970s. But the conditions that made frontier knowledge necessary haven't disappeared. They're just waiting for the next storm, the next crisis, the next moment when modern systems fail and ancient principles are all that stand between survival and catastrophe. When that moment comes, and it will come, the people who studied the cave shelter in Montana, who understood why it worked, who preserved the knowledge even when they didn't need it themselves, those people will be the ones who survive and help others survive. That's worth a subscription. That's worth preserving. That's worth remembering when the snow starts falling and doesn't stop.